The thing I like best about a silent retreat is the food. That might be surprising. You might think, oh, it's the prayer and all of that stuff, which is good. But actually, what I find is being on silent retreat, I enjoy the food so much. And at first, it's a bit unnatural because you sit down with other people around a table and you're all on a silent retreat, so you don't talk to each other. You just sit silently and eat together, which is a bit unnatural at first. But what happens when you do that because you're not paying attention to the conversation is that I find I eat so mindfully that I find the food so delicious. Just like I remember having just like chips once, and it was like, oh, these are the best chips I've ever had. They weren't. It's perfectly nice food, but it wasn't gourmet food or anything like that. But just the act of paying attention to food and giving that kind of holy attention that you're training yourself to be in when you're on retreat, giving that to food makes it come alive and be so much more delicious than it would be otherwise. I also love communion. I love communion. And I'm not in the kind of Christian tradition that takes communion, the sharing of bread and wine. I'm not from a Christian tradition that takes that as really being the body and blood of Jesus. That's not where I sit at all. And yet the act of paying attention, the act of giving so much sacred attention, saying, look at how holy this thing is, and with that kind of attention, eating and drinking. It is a place where I encounter God, and I think it is a place where many people encounter God through that act of paying such holy attention, such attention to the holiness of reality that reality becomes holy in our mouths. We don't often talk about tasting God. We might talk about hearing God or things like that, but the very most intimate sense of taste is something we don't talk about in relation to God very much, probably because it is so intimate. Because to taste um is something that is it means something's getting so close to me that it's not something that's far away, that's something, oh look, I'm looking at that thing like I'm looking at a telescope through God that's millions of miles away over there. If I'm tasting God, God is near. God is so near to me that God is becoming me and I'm becoming God. Because if I eat something, it enters into my body and becomes part of me. The very division between me and what I am tasting is dissolving in the act of consumption, the act of eating something. And so to speak of tasting God is to speak of an act in which the very difference between me and God begins to be dissolved. The very meanness and the very godness, the two become one. And there's a also a kind of a sensual and a sexual act to that. You can imagine there's a kind of sexual metaphor there as well, isn't there? Of tasting, of connecting with another person in such intimacy. The two become one. The mystics seem to suggest that this is possible, and the mystics tell us where this has been when they have found this connection. Jesus, we can think of in these terms, or Mansa al-Halaja, a Sufi Islamic mystic who is said to have said once, I am the truth. Like here is the truth. Here is one of the names of God. I and God have become one. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said, there is no wall between the soul and God. There is no ceiling between my head and the heavens and the skies. So there is no wall where the soul ends and God begins. There's a continuity between those two things. And our instinct can be to worship these great mystical figures who have got to this sort of place of holiness, saying, "Oh, look at these very holy people. We should worship these holy people." But the point is, I think, to follow the path that they are on, rather, to be drawn with the same hunger to taste God, the same hunger to become one with God that drove all the great mystical, spiritual, religious teachers. And we might think we won't get there, and we probably won't get there in terms of becoming the kind of spiritually enlightened, or however you want to say it, kind of person Jesus was. It may be something, maybe it happens when we die, I don't know, or maybe we taste it before death. But even if we're never going to get to that quiet place of where we totally experience our oneness with God, we can be hungry for it. We can be hungry knowing how delicious, how delicious God is. And that hunger can drive us onwards to want to get to even a tiny, tiny taste of God. If we can, maybe we can only manage a tiny taste of God, but the hunger for that and the walk towards that in smelling God, in seeing God, in hearing God, in feeling and touching God, in tasting God. The journey towards that is a journey worth taking.